A quick word about logical fallacies. We've already mentioned logical fallacies. A fallacy is a mistake in thinking. It's a mistake in reasoning. Now, it's important to note that a logical fallacy in an argument does not prove that the conclusion is wrong. What a mistake means, if the point of logical reasoning is to give you reasons to believe the conclusion, what a logical fallacy, a mistake in your reasoning, does is it destroys the reason for believing the conclusion. So you really actually can't know from that argument whether or not the conclusion is true or false. In other words, rather than giving you more certainty that the conclusion is true, you end up with 0% certainty. You don't know if the argument is flawed. You don't know whether or not that conclusion is true or not. It might be true, it might be false, you just don't know. So here are a few fallacies of induction. One of them is what we call the hasty conclusion fallacy. And the name makes it fairly obvious what it is. What a hasty conclusion fallacy is when you draw a general conclusion on the basis of an inadequate number or type of observations. So we saw that, for example, with bloodletting, where people observed that patients who had bloodletting felt better, but that's not really a valid observation for determining whether or not the human body is actually helped by bloodletting. A lot of prejudices are actually based on hasty conclusion fallacies, where you observe a particular type of person doing something once, and you therefore conclude that all of those people of that group will behave in that same way. A second logical fallacy we've already talked about is confirmation bias. In the confirmation bias fallacy, observations that support the conclusion are noted and they reinforce the belief in the conclusion, while observations that would refute the conclusion are either consciously or unconsciously ignored. So we saw that, for example, with the flat earthers. There's a number of observations that we've talked about that demonstrate that the earth is not flat, but the flat earthers simply ignore those. Same thing with that lesson we did on the people who claim we didn't land on the moon. There's ample evidence that we did land on the moon, but those pieces of evidence are just ignored by the moon hoaxers. And again, bloodletting was a good example of confirmation bias. A third fallacy of induction is something else we've talked about, I believe. This is the post hoc fallacy. Remember, the full name is post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. And this is a result where you conclude that because something always happens after something else, that something else must be causing it in the first place. And so the examples we saw there is, for example, that the Egyptians noted that the rising of Sothis always precedes the flooding of the Nile, and so therefore they concluded that the rising of Sothis actually causes the flooding of the Nile. And again, the same thing with bloodletting. You let blood, the patient recovers, as they most often will if they're just left alone, and therefore doctors concluded that the bloodletting caused the recovery. An important thing to remember here is that correlation, two things happening together, does not prove causation, that the one thing has caused the other.